The airplane shook so violently that screams echoed through every row. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Luggage crashed onto passengers below, and terrified parents pulled their children close. Then the captain's trembling voice broke through the speaker's knot, asking for a doctor or a police officer, but for something no one expected. Is there anyone on board who has experienced flying F-18 fighter jets? If you do, identify yourself immediately. Silence swallowed the cabin. Hundreds of frightened faces looked around, hoping someone would answer. Instead, they found themselves staring at a quiet teenage girl sitting alone near the middle of the aircraft. She slowly removed her headphones, stood up without panic, and calmly raised her hand. She was only 16 years old. Some passengers laughed in disbelief. Others thought she had lost her mind. None of them knew that the next decision she made would determine whether every soul on that flight would ever see home again. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. Just 3 hours before that desperate announcement echoed through the cabin, Flight 782 had looked like every other overnight journey leaving the West Coast. The terminal buzzed with familiar airport life. Travelers hurried past, glowing departure boards, coffee cups in hand, while children dragged colorful backpacks behind exhausted parents. Business professionals answered last-minute phone calls. Couples searched for charging outlets, and vacation photos filled social media before airplane mode would soon silence every phone. At Gate 18, passengers slowly lined up as boarding began. The crew greeted everyone with practiced smiles, unaware that this routine flight would soon become the most unforgettable night of their careers. Inside the aircraft sat 219 passengers and 9 crew members, each carrying their own destination, worries, and dreams. Among them was a quiet 16-year-old girl traveling alone, wearing a faded school jacket, simply sneakers and thin glasses. She avoided attention, resting a thick aviation book on her lap. To everyone around her, she looked like nothing more than an ordinary high school student returning home after a weekend away. No one, not the passengers, not the crew, not even the people sitting inches from her could have imagined that she was the only person on board already prepared for the nightmare waiting above the clouds. Her name was Emily Carter, and although she looked like any other high school junior, her life had never been ordinary. 8 years earlier, Emily had lost her mother in a tragic highway accident. Overnight, her world changed forever. From that day on, it was just Emily and her father. Commander Nathan Carter, a veteran fighter pilot who had spent most of his career flying F-18s for the Navy. Instead of letting grief define them, they built an unbreakable bond through the one thing that always gave them hope: the sky. When Emily turned 10, her father noticed she wasn't fascinated by airplanes the way most children were. She wanted to know how they worked. She memorized cockpit layouts, studied emergency checklists, and filled notebooks with sketches of aircraft systems. Rather than treating it like a childhood phase, her father trained her with complete seriousness. Over the next 6 years, weekends became lessons inside professional simulators instead of amusement parks. While other teenagers spent afternoons scrolling through social media, Emily practiced engine failures, hydraulic malfunctions, electrical emergencies, and impossible landings until every procedure became instinct. By 16, she had accumulated hundreds of hours in advanced military flight simulators. Looking around the cabin that evening, no one saw years of discipline hidden behind her quiet smile. They only saw another teenager on a late-night flight completely unaware that every lesson her father had ever taught her was about to be tested in the real world. Nearly 3 hours after takeoff, Flight 782 cruised peacefully above the Rocky Mountains. At 39,000 feet, most passengers had fallen asleep beneath dim cabin lights. Soft engine noise filled the aircraft, creating the familiar rhythm that makes overnight flights feel almost hypnotic. Emily wasn't sleeping. She had closed her book minutes earlier after noticing something that didn't belong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was simply wrong. A faint vibration pulsed through the floor beneath her feet. The right side of the aircraft carried a strange humming pattern that repeated every few seconds before disappearing again. To everyone else, it was just another sound inside a large airplane. To Emily, it sounded like trouble. She quietly checked her watch and counted under her breath. 27, 28, 29. Then the entire aircraft exploded with a deafening bang. The cabin lurched sharply to the right. Passengers were thrown sideways as overhead bins burst open, sending bags crashing into the aisle. Oxygen masks dropped instantly while terrified screams filled the cabin. A baby cried uncontrollably. Someone shouted, We're going down. Emily secured her oxygen mask in one smooth movement before helping the elderly woman beside her fit hers correctly. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the speakers. We've lost our right engine. We're declaring an emergency and diverting to the nearest airport. Around her, panic spread like wildfire, but Emily wasn't frightened by the announcement. She was frightened because the aircraft wasn't responding like a plane with only one failed engine. Something far more dangerous had just happened, and she could feel it through the controls of the airplane without ever stepping inside the cockpit. The cabin had barely begun to recover from the first explosion when another violent jolt ripped through the aircraft. This one wasn't as loud, but somehow it felt even worse. The lights flickered. Warning alarms echoed through the cabin, and the plane suddenly felt heavier, as if invisible hands were pulling it toward the earth. Emily closed her eyes for just a second. The backup power system, she whispered. Her heart sank. This wasn't simply an engine failure anymore. Multiple systems were failing at once. Then the intercom clicked on again. The captain's voice was gone. Instead, a frightened female voice struggled to stay composed. Attention. This is First Officer Sarah Mitchell. The captain has suffered a medical emergency and is no longer able to fly. If there is anyone on board with experience flying military fighter, aircraft especially an F-18, please identify yourself immediately. The cabin froze. No one morbid parents hugged their children tighter. Some passengers began praying. Others stared at each other, hoping anyone would stand. Emily quietly unbuckled her seatbelt. Without hesitation, she raised her hand. A nearby businessman let out an incredulous laugh. She's kidding, right? An elderly woman grabbed Emily's wrist. Honey, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. This isn't the time for jokes. Emily met her gaze with complete calm. I'm not joking. She reached into her backpack and carefully pulled out a worn training notebook filled with emergency flight procedures. My father has trained Navy fighter pilots for years, she said steadily. I've spent hundreds of hours practicing emergency situations inside professional F-18 simulators, hydraulic failures, engine fires, manual flight control. I've trained for all of them. The flight attendant rushed toward her, still uncertain. Emily took one determined step into the aisle. If I stay here, she said quietly, everyone on this airplane could lose their chance to go home, for the first time since the emergency began. The flight attendant looked into her eyes and realized something every other passenger had missed. She wasn't pretending. She already knew exactly what she was about to face. The cockpit door swung open, and Emily stepped into a scene that looked nothing like the comm training simulator she had spent years mastering. Red warning lights flashed across every panel. Alarms screamed from multiple systems, and the aircraft shuddered beneath her feet as if fighting to stay in the sky. Captain Michael Reynolds sat slumped over his controls, unconscious. Paramedics couldn't reach him yet. Every second mattered. First Officer Sarah Mitchell gripped the control column with trembling arms, sweat covering her forehead. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. This is the pilot, she asked in disbelief. She's a teenager. Emily ignored the doubt. Her eyes swept across the instrument panel with astonishing speed. Right engine destroyed, she said calmly. Hydraulic pressure is collapsing. Backup systems are failing, and your remaining controls are responding with a delay. That's why you're struggling to keep the wings level. Sarah stared at her. I never told you any of that. You didn't have to. Emily pointed toward a warning display. You're making corrections too aggressively because the aircraft isn't responding immediately. Wait for each input. If you keep fighting it, you'll overcorrect and lose stability. For a brief moment, the cockpit fell silent except for the alarms. Sarah cautiously eased her grip, following Emily's instructions. The aircraft responded exactly as Emily predicted. A flicker of hope crossed the first officer's exhausted face. Who are you? I'm Emily Carter, she replied. My father trained Navy fighter pilots. Everything he taught me was for emergencies like this. Without wasting another second, she grabbed the radio microphone. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 782. Request immediate military assistance. We have multiple flight control failures, an incapacitated captain, and a critical hydraulic emergency. Please establish contact with Commander Nathan Carter and dispatch military aircraft for visual escort. The radio remained silent for several long seconds. Then a controller answered. Flight 782. Standby. We're making the calls now. Emily took a slow breath and looked through the windshield into the endless darkness ahead. For the first time that night, she realized they weren't fighting this battle alone anymore. Less than 7 minutes later, two bright lights pierced the darkness outside the cockpit windows. "They're here," Sarah whispered. Two Navy F-18 fighter jets swept in from the left, flying with breathtaking precision before matching the damaged airliner's speed. Their navigation lights blinked steadily, a reassuring sight against the endless black sky. The radio crackled. "Flight 782. This is Falcon 1. We've established visual contact. We'll stay with you all the way to the runway." Before Emily could respond, another familiar voice filled her headset. "Emily! It's Dad." For just a split second, the fearless teenager closed her eyes. "Dad, I've been listening since the controller patched me in," Commander Carter said, his voice calm despite the fear hidden beneath it. "Forget everything else. Focus on your training. One checklist at a time. One decision at a time." Emily swallowed hard. "I'm trying," but Sarah's exhausted. "The controls are getting heavier." "I know," he replied, then become her second set of hands. "Don't rush the airplane. Fly ahead of it. Let it respond before making another correction." Emily nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Understood." Sarah finally released the controls for a moment, flexing her numb fingers. "I can't keep this up much longer," she admitted. "You don't have to," Emily answered. She wrapped both hands around the control column. The resistance was overwhelming. It felt as though she was trying to steer a moving building instead of an aircraft. Every small movement demanded every ounce of her strength. The airplane answered each correction several seconds late, forcing her to think far ahead instead of reacting. "Ease left. Now hold it," Emily murmured. The massive jet slowly obeyed. Outside, the fighter pilots watched every movement. "You're perfectly aligned," Falcon 1 reported. "Maintain this heading." Inside the passenger cabin, people noticed something changing. The violent rolling had eased. The aircraft still felt wounded, but it was no longer fighting wildly against the sky. For the first time since the emergency began, frightened passengers stopped screaming. Many simply closed their eyes and prayed. None of them knew that a 16-year-old girl, an exhausted first officer, and two fighter pilots were working together above the clouds fighting with everything they had to bring 219 strangers safely back to Earth. The glow of the airport finally appeared on the horizon. Runway lights stretched across the darkness like a narrow path of hope, while dozens of emergency vehicles waited beside the runway, their flashing lights painting the night in red and blue. Firefighters, paramedics, and rescue crews stood ready, knowing this landing could end in either a miracle or a disaster. Inside the cockpit, every second became a battle. "Altitude, 1,000 feet, Emily announced, her voice calm despite the pounding in her chest. Sarah nodded her exhausted hands, gripping the controls once again while Emily monitored every instrument. "The landing gear is locked. Flaps are limited. Approach speed is good." Outside, Falcon 1 never left their side. "You look stable," the fighter pilot reported. "Stay exactly where you are." At 500 feet, the damaged aircraft suddenly drifted off the center line. Sarah instinctively turned the controls too hard. "Easy," Emily shouted. "Don't chase it. Let the airplane answer first." Sarah immediately eased the pressure. For 2 terrifying seconds, the massive jet seemed to ignore them. Then, slowly, the nose aligned with the runway once more. Everyone in the cockpit exhaled. 300 feet. The runway rushed toward them. 200. The control column grew heavier than ever, forcing Sarah to pull with nearly all her remaining strength. Emily watched the altitude indicator without blinking. 100 feet. The fighter pilots held formation until the final possible moment before peeling away into the night. 50 feet, Emily called. "Start the flare!" "Now?" Sarah pulled back with everything she had left. The aircraft dropped. For one endless heartbeat, nobody knew whether the landing gear would hold. Then boom, the main wheels slammed onto the runway with a thunderous impact. The entire aircraft shook violently before racing forward as reverse thrust roared to life. Smoke poured from the tires, while emergency crews chased alongside. The passengers were thrown against their seatbelts, holding their breath until the giant airliner finally slowed. Slower. Slower. Then it stopped. Silence filled the cockpit. No alarms mattered anymore. 219 frightened passengers were alive. Emily looked down at her trembling hands for the first time that night and whispered the only words she could manage. We made it. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then reality rushed back all at once. The cabin erupted with sobs, laughter, and thunderous applause. Strangers embraced each other without exchanging names. Parents held their children tighter than ever before, while others simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the fact that they were still alive. Outside, emergency crews surrounded the aircraft within moments. Medical teams rushed aboard and quickly carried Captain Reynolds to a waiting ambulance. Though weak, he had regained consciousness, another miracle on a night already filled with them. As passengers slowly stepped into the terminal, many instinctively searched for the young girl who had disappeared into the cockpit nearly an hour earlier. When Emily finally walked through the arrival gate, the conversation stopped. The elderly woman who had once begged her to stay in her seat slowly approached, still clutching the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Tears streamed down her face.